It's my honor and indeed privilege to present and introduce Tema Smith, who is a diversity advocate, writer, and Jewish community builder. She is the Director of Jewish Outreach and Partnerships for the Anti-Defamation League. Tema was previously the Director of Professional Development at 18 Doors, formerly Interfaith Family, an organization that empowers people in interfaith relationships to engage in Jewish life and make Jewish choices, and encourages Jewish communities to welcome them. This comes after 7 years as a synagogue professional, most recently as the Director of Community Engagement at Holy Blossom Temple, Toronto's oldest synagogue. And now I present to you Tema Smith.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. It's so great to be here with you today. So today we're talking about this idea of from shared pasts to shared futures, and the dogs are starting, Black-Jewish relations in context. So what we're really here to talk about is sort of the myths and realities of sort of the civil rights movement era alliance, the fracture, and which is very real and also more complicated, and where we are now and where we might be going as communities. So I always like to start this by situating myself in this conversation. I am a mixed race woman. I'm the daughter of a Black Bahamian American father and a white Ashkenazi Jewish mother. You can see my parents and a little baby me in this picture. I was raised in Toronto, my mother's hometown, after my parents moved here to escape the racism that made them feel endangered as an interracial couple in New York in the late 70s. So I got to talking about this idea of Black-Jewish relations, not just as a professional endeavor, but also as something deeply personal to me, and very much related to my own past. And I'm going to pick up the puppy, otherwise chaos is going to ensue. This is the dog. He will probably climb into the frame again. So I want to start with a disclaimer. While we will be talking about some history, I am not a historian. This talk is not a history lesson, and there are so many books out there that do by historians and historiographers that actually go into primary sources, as well as some of the sources from the time that can really paint some of the picture of the 60s and 70s in sort of communal relations, and talk a little bit about how things transpired then. I also want to say that I start with the 60s. Of course, that is not the beginning of Black-Jewish relations in this country. It is a much longer story. And by the 60s, a lot of what would eventually cause fractures between the communities were already at play. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I want to begin my framing here with the philosopher Charles W. Mills, who unfortunately passed away in September of this year. He has an essay that he wrote in 1998 that we're going to come back to a few times today, called Dark Ontologies, Blacks, Jews, and White Supremacy. And Dr. Mills was a philosopher who was really deeply committed to giving a racial analysis to Enlightenment philosophy, and was a scholar of Immanuel Kant, and was really interested in how our sort of liberal models are based in these Enlightenment sort of philosophies of what it means to be human, what it means to be equal, that were written by people who, in the case of Immanuel Kant, for example, was also an anthropologist who did a lot of work justifying slavery and justifying the dehumanization of people from the African continent. And Charles writes this essay about Black, Jews, and white supremacy, not really to actually contribute to the conversation about Black-Jewish relations, but actually to use Black-Jewish relations as a stand-in to analyze race as a political system. And he looks at it because he says that Black people and Jews have had differential and evolving relations, and that those relations need to be put into a historical context. And the questions that we need to be asking of all sort of moments are where groups are related with respect to the political system of race. And that political system of race produces a psychology, and the differential locations produce different psychologies, different social cognitions of the system itself, and different ways of affirming ethnic identity and self-identifying racially. And finally, different moral assertions of peoplehood and demand for respect. So that is sort of how he frames an article, and he actually goes very deeply into the different ways in which Black communities and Jewish communities are situated vis-a-vis racial politics in the United States. So the Black-Jewish Alliance. When I first put together slides for this, it was the day after Inauguration Day, when these two lovely senators were just being sworn in. And what do we think of when we think of the Black-Jewish Alliance? This really said it all. Here are a bunch of headlines from that week. Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff rekindling Black-Jewish Alliance. On this MLK Day, the Black-Jewish Alliance is revived. With Ossoff and Warnock in Georgia, the Democrats were able to draw on decades of cooperation dating back to the days of Martin Luther King Jr. in the 50s. How Warnock and Ossoff's victories evoke the history of the Black freedom struggle. John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock are a heroic new, it said Black and Jewish, pair or something like that. And notes here that Ossoff described his trajectory from an intern for John Lewis, and it continues on that way. Georgia's Black Jewish campaign is the latest chapter in a long history, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, Senator-elect John Ossoff will be sworn in. He will be sworn in on Hebrew scripture that belonged to the historic Atlanta rabbi, Jacob Rothschild, a civil rights activist and close ally of Dr. King. So what is this all conjuring here? It's pointing to this myth of the civil rights era, this Black-Jewish partnership that was on one hand, very, very real and tangible, and on the other hand, highly mythologized. There's the famous, and I'll frame this also by saying that I speak about this from the perspective of being in the Jewish community and talking about race a lot inside sort of Jewish spaces. So if my focus seems more heavily on the Jewish side of this conversation, that is why. So the civil rights era, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel prayed with his feet. You can see him there. This is a famous picture from the March in Selma. The Freedom Riders, a disproportionate number of the white Freedom Riders were Jews from the North, and so on and so forth. Of course, the civil rights era story was not so simple. There were these very powerful moments, and of course, alliances between organizations like the ADL, where I work now, and the Urban League and the NAACP. The NAACP and Urban League were very famously had heavy involvement by Jews at their founding, as did some organizations like Southern Poverty Law Center later on. And so this is very real. However, the way that this often gets told is it was like this monolithic support from the Jewish community to support the civil rights movement, and that Jews were always welcomed by Black civil rights fighters. We simplified the story to create a straightforward narrative of a seamless alliance that then fell apart. But we know that then there was Jewish community racism, and there was racism in the Black community, or anti-Semitism in the Black community as well. And one of the books that was on that slide and in the email with resources that you'll get later, there's a book from the late 60s called Black Anti-Semitism, Jewish Racism, that has essays from both sides of that conversation. And I'm going to actually quote from two of them today. So we have, and I'll come back a little bit to some of the factors at play within movements themselves at that time that led to the overall fracture. So I want to really focus on not on the sort of mythologized version of people showing up, which of course is extremely important and extremely relevant, but also to point out that some of the things that are currently causing conflicts were already causing conflict in the 60s. So I'm going to point first to James Baldwin. James Baldwin has this famous essay, and I'm going to use his language. So I am going to, when people use the term Negro, I am going to say that. James Baldwin, Negroes are anti-Semitic because they are anti-white. He wrote this in 1967. And he says, the ultimate hope for genuine Black-white dialogue in this country lies in the recognition that the driven European serf merely created another serf here and created him on the basis of color. And he says, no one can deny that the Jew was a party to this, but it is senseless to assert that this was because of his Jewishness. One can be disappointed in the Jew if one is romantic enough for not having learned from history, but if people did learn from history, history would be very different. And he goes on to talk about that there is a rift between the Black community and the Jewish people already forming here. And he talks a little bit about the Holocaust and that sort of the cynical usage of a history of oppression. And he says, and he says that it's to use his exact words, because I love how Baldwin writes, it is galling to be told by a Jew whom you know to be exploiting you that he cannot possibly be doing what you know he is doing because he is a Jew. And he talks a little bit about some of the dynamics of for example, Jewish storekeepers locking up their store for the night, going home with the Black community's money in the pocket to a clean neighborhood miles from you that you can't actually enter, and so on and so forth. And he says, nor can it help the relationship between most Negroes and most Jews when part of this money then gets given back to civil rights movements. And he sort of very cynically says, in light of what is now known as the white backlash, this money can be looked on as conscience money merely, as a money given to keep the Negro happy and in his place and out of white neighborhoods. So very, very cynical here. Pointing to some of the sources inside the Jewish community at the same time, Al Vorspan, who passed away at the very beginning of the pandemic or right before, I think it was at the very beginning, founded the organization that's now known as the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. And in 1969, this is also in that volume, and I've included a PDF scan of his essay because I think it's phenomenal. He also sort of says, you know, and he's speaking to the Jewish community now, and Baldwin was also mostly addressing the Jewish community. He says, even if we beat every Black anti-Semite into the ground with a 2x4 marked, remember the 6 million, will we eliminate anti-Semitism? And he sort of frames it in terms of the social factors that were happening at that time, that in the 60s, you have the opening up of the suburbs to Jews. And so Jews who had previously lived in mixed neighborhoods in cities left for the suburbs. And he says, this is actually exacerbating Black Jewish relations because there aren't those existential neighborly contacts anymore. Instead, you're left with merchant, customer, landlord, tenant, social worker, client. These are inherently tense, unequal relations, fraught with conflict and resentment. And he says he really attributes this to what we now call white flight. And so he talks really about a lot of the root of anti-Semitism coming from the Black community is tied to economic factors. And he says that it's no different than any other antisocial fury is the language, prejudice and antisocial fury is the language he uses. So you already have in the 60s, and I'm going to go to an earlier 1960s source, last also from inside the Jewish community, some growing recognition of the different ways in which society is evolving for the Jewish community and the Black community. When you look back at 1963, and this is actually a famous speech from the conference where Rabbi Heschel, who we saw marching next to Dr. King in that first slide, this is from the conference where they met. And he talks about that his observation that for a lot of people, for Jews that and other white people, that they know that there are that they have bad conscience about the situation of Black Americans. And this, of course, is before the passing of the Civil Rights Act and all of that. And he says there's several ways that we can deal with it. Extenuate our responsibility. We can't do anything about it. Keep the Negro out of sight. Alleviate our qualms by pointing to the progress made while it's getting better, is what that one is. Delegate the responsibility to the courts. Silence our conscience by cultivating indifference, or dedicate our minds to issues of a far more sublime nature. And this was a religion conference. So he's sort of saying, you know, the people who want to hide in theology. And he focuses in on the idea of, he goes in depth on each of these, but I want to point to what he talks about keeping Black people out of sight. And he says, the word proclaims, love thy neighbor. So we make it impossible for him to be a neighbor. And then he points to an editorial in the Christian Century from 1962 that talks about the ghettoization that is happening in America. And in this editorial, they use language like a partial apartheid, economic, social, political, and religious, is enforced by white people of the US. And it's an isolation technique, essentially. And then they conclude, so long as the racially exclusive patterns of suburban America continue, the Negro will remain in exile in his own land. So we're seeing over and over and over again, activists recognizing an inherent tension here about showing up, an inherent tension about the ways in which basically whiteness is being opened up to Jews in terms of economic opportunity afforded by whiteness. I'm flipping now to a 2018 source that looks back at the 70s, which is really where the rift kind of completes itself. Eric Ward, who is the executive director of the Western States Center and who is a senior fellow at Southern Poverty Law Center and one of the leading experts on white nationalism in the US right now, and I am so honored to be able to call him a colleague, talks about the evolution of identity politics in an interview that he does with Tikkun magazine, which is a magazine on the Jewish left. And he says, so all of these dynamics are happening, right? The Civil Rights Act is passed, and the suburbs are open to Jewish communities who had previously faced some housing segregation, and it becomes, with sort of the identity politics movement, it becomes more okay to sort of identify as culturally Jewish and so on and so forth, and be accepted and included. And he says, but there's also and he says, and so as the Jewish community enters the 70s, they find themselves facing less, not none, but less discrimination. And so he says it's actually interesting because what ended up happening is Jews find themselves in a situation being defined as white, not only by white society, but also by the political left. And he continues and says it's really in the late 60s and into the 70s where a discourse developed around anti-racism that was so strict that it actually downplayed Jewish identity, except to assume the primary role of white ally. So he talks about if leftist, progressive, and liberal Jews of certain phenotypes, and we are going to loop back to the fact that not all Jews are what would be considered white. If leftist, progressive, and liberal Jews refuse to identify as white, they found themselves without a space, without a home, and as a result, many disengaged or began to claim whiteness as a primary identity in order to belong somewhere. The final stages of this fracture are also happening with evolutions of identity politics elsewhere. You probably have heard claims, the sort of who's a Zionist hot potato. So, you know, people will claim there was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, there was an op-ed saying that if Martin Luther King was alive today, he would be an anti-Zionist. And then there were furious responses to it saying that Martin Luther King was a Zionist. And how can you say this? By the late 60s, actually there was considerable Black support for Zionism before 1967. One of the final stages of the fracture, though, is after 67 and the annexing of, not the annexing, rather, the occupying of the West Bank. Some of those dynamics changed. At the same time, the Black Power movement was becoming much more powerful. And so you have these sort of competing nationalisms that led to even more of a fracture. The Mark Dollinger book that I put on the first slide, Black Power, Jewish Politics, is actually really fascinating because he shows that even though publicly there was a lot of sort of distrust of each other, that actually there was a lot of inspiration that was taken from each other about the ways that these nationalisms were sort of transpiring on the American stage. Really fascinating stuff, highly recommend. So like I said, this isn't a history, so we're skipping ahead to the early 90s. The fracture is kind of happening. Jews are no longer, for the most part, in the civil rights movement, except for certain alliances that continue to exist. And of course, we end up with one of the most sort of major flare-ups of tension with the Crown Heights riots in the early 90s. And there are communities that still, Al Sharpton is sort of welcome in some Jewish spaces and not welcome in others. This is around the time that Jesse Jackson famously calls New York Jaime Town, and so on and so forth. This is happening around the same time as Louis Farrakhan is at sort of the height of his power and publishes his book, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, asserting that Jews controlled the slave trade, which is patently false, but also picks up on anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish control. And the subtitle, there's 3 volumes, and the one that's on the screen here, How Jews Gain Control of the Black American Economy. This tension persists today, and some of you may recall the episode between sort of the Jewish community and the Women's March, where Tamika Mallory, in the picture posted here when she was one of the co-chairs, posted this picture with Farrakhan and said that he was the GOAT, the greatest of all time, which led to some considerable rifts between the Jewish community who had been aligned with the Women's March previously, and a lot of tension and conversation between Jews on the left and the Women's March leadership. So how did we get here? My argument is that one of the main ways that we got here is that racism and anti-Semitism function differently and set the stage for the fracture. So one of the frameworks that I've been using a lot to talk about the difference between sort of pre-civil rights movement exclusion is a differentiation between legal exclusion and social exclusion that led to different access to whiteness. Legal exclusion, in sort of my framing here, is the right to own property, the right to marry white people, we'll come back to that one, and the right to vote. And this is legal. You couldn't do these things. It was criminal if you were Black to do these things in many parts of the United States. Social exclusion included things like private club restrictions, neighborhood covenants, employment restrictions and quotas, which is de facto exclusion. This doesn't mean none of it. It wasn't criminal to hold a job. You just probably wouldn't get one if you were Jewish because of the way that anti-Semitism functioned. What does social exclusion look like? These are real signs, one from the US, one from Canada. Privileges of the swimming pool are extended only to approved Gentiles. Of course, Black people were also excluded from the swimming pools. And this one in Quebec, notice Jews are not wanted here in Saint-Agathe, so scram while the going is good. The notice in French notably is different. It says Jews aren't wanted here, and Saint-Agathe is a French-Canadian village, and we're going to keep it that way. Whereas we know what legal exclusion looked like. Jim Crow South and the ban on interracial marriage that was only that Loving versus Virginia struck down finally. Now, miscegenation laws didn't exist all over the United States. So why do I still use this frame? even in places like New York State, where miscegenation laws didn't exist, the racial line was maintained through who was allowed to marry who. And a test case for this is the Rhinelander trial. This happened in New York in 1925. Leonard Rhinelander, what came from a wealthy family, and married this woman. And in the end, filed for an annulment because divorce, of course, was not allowed, filed for an annulment on the basis that she defrauded him by not revealing that she was part Black. And so the famous scene of the trial that you see sort of depicted here, they clear all of the observers from the courtroom, and she is asked to strip in front of the jury so that they can ascertain whether he ought to have realistically known before they got married, because they had premarital relations, whether he ought to have realistically known that she was a colored woman by seeing her naked, which is really a fascinating case and like just an absolutely humiliating moment for this poor woman. But it shows just the way in which the legal system was actually used to propagate or to maintain that color line, even in places where it wasn't criminalized in the same way. It's really interesting. One of the most interesting ways, I think, to look at racial politics in the United States over time is who was allowed to own property and who was allowed to marry white people, because the racial designations in the US were based on a Black-white color line. And so you can actually find cases from, say, the 30s of, and I can't remember exactly the details, whether it was somebody who was East Asian or South Asian, but they wanted to marry somebody white, and it actually had to go before the court to decide whether their race was Black or white in terms of this sort of line, which side of the color line it was on. And so Jews were often excluded from, were allowed to marry white people. I have to plug in my computer, so hopefully give me 1 second here. It just said I have 10% battery. I do not want to lose you all today. So. Okay, we are saved. I did not realize I was not plugged in. So Jews from the beginning of America were on the white side of the color line, even when considered a lower class of white. So what are the flashpoints? I sort of look at 3 different flashpoints of how the breakdown of this Black-Jewish alliance has happened. The first is whiteness, who has access and who does not. So we have white flight versus redlining, school desegregation, access to privilege, and so on and so forth under that category. The next is what I call the myth of Black dangerousness, which is reactions to anti-Semitism from white individuals and communities versus Black individuals and communities have often been remarked. It's often been remarked that the Jewish community reacts much more strongly when somebody Black says something anti-Semitic than to when somebody white says something anti-Semitic. And we can think of recent examples like Nick Cannon saying something anti-Semitic a la sort of Nation of Islam style conspiracy theory versus former Congressman Steve King actually reading from Hitler's Mein Kampf on the floor of Congress, and the tone of the sort of the outrage on both. And then on the flip side, and this I think comes back, Baldwin really nicely captures it in his article, and some of what's really fascinating about the ways in which sort of long-standing conspiracy theories and myths about Jews have found home in anti-Semitism inside the Black community. So for example, stories of Jewish involvement in the slave trade, George Soros or the Rothschilds sort of controlling the pawns, the idea of the Jewish media, so on and so forth. And if you follow sort of Baldwin's track on this, and I think he is bang on, he talks about the roots of some of this in traditional Christian anti-Semitism. So for example, it isn't false that Jews have taken on the role of merchant over time, but it's largely because Jews were forced into that by being restricted from other professions and so on and so forth. And so the Jew becomes, in a place like America, the Jew becomes the sort of stand-in for the economy in certain communities. So I'm going to spend some time now talking about this idea of Jewish whiteness, because I think so much of this hinges on, so much of this breakdown hinges on this first flashpoint. And the myth of Black dangerousness and the sort of conspiracy theories, I think, are in many ways subcategories of how Jews have related to whiteness in America. When I teach this as a course on its own, I actually do this in 3 parts. I do Kwame Anthony Appiah, who had a piece in The Ethicist in the New York Times that answers the question, are Jews white, with a resounding yes. And then I'm not including him today, but I'll tell you just a touch of what he says. And then I want to look at 2 of the people who choose to complicate it a little bit more. And what Kwame Anthony Appiah argues is that, of course, we have sort of a racial line in the US. And he says that there's a sort of intellectual error compounded with a moral error. The intellectual error of race is that unlike groups are classed together as alike, and can be significantly unlike each other and still classed together as alike, which is how the entirety of descendants of the African diaspora and their descendants, no matter how they are mixed or whatever, get classed as Black, and Jews get lumped in with white despite having been oppressed by white people at various times. And it's compounded with this moral error because those sort of myths and that intellectual error is used to maintain difference and maintain hierarchy. And he goes on to say, like, you don't really have a choice. It's also what society sees you as. I'm going to point now to another colleague of mine, David Schraub. He's a legal scholar and a political theorist who sits on a task force looking at anti-Semitism with me. And he wrote a piece a few years ago called White Jews, an Intersectional Approach. And he asks the question, he says, let's take for granted the existence of Jews of color, and I am going to loop back, I keep promising to do that, but I promise it's in here. The existence of Jews who are not white means that there must be some Jews who are white. Let's just take this for granted. And he says, but we can take actually a critical race theory perspective and an intersectional analysis here to ask the question, what does whiteness, the idea that Jews are white, do to Jewishness? And he says that actually it's really fascinating that Jewish whiteness can actually accelerate certain kinds of anti-Semitism. And he says white Jews still have access to whiteness, that's a given, but he says it's conditional because who has the power to define who is white? Jews do not necessarily have that power for themselves. And he says that accepting that in relations with African Americans and other people of color in America, white Jews are indeed white should not be taken to negate the existence or importance of anti-Semitism as a distinctive access of marginalization. And he says, and this is sort of the key point here, that access of marginalization cannot always fully be disassociated or disentangled from whiteness as a social concept. And what he's really interested in, and this comes back to that idea of conspiracy theories and myths of Jewish nefariousness, that because the historic anti-Semitism has painted Jews as powerful, has painted Jews as conspiratorial, has painted Jews as taking advantage of people for their own gain. And whiteness as a social structure has essentially treated certain groups in ways that align with some of those conspiracy theories. When Jews became white, it actually accelerates or serves to accelerate some of those sorts of conspiracy theory forms of anti-Semitism against Jews. Because if whiteness is power and Jews are secretly powerful, then white Jews are ultra powerful. Eric Ward, just returning to him very briefly. So remember where we left Eric from where he's talking about the 70s. it takes also, he says no, Jews aren't white, but what he's actually saying is it's complicated, very similar to what David is saying. And he says insisting Jews identify as white and therefore privileged shut down the conversation about anti-Semitism, and the political right was the only place to identify manifestations, because how could a white ethnic group suffering compare to what was happening to communities of color or for women, for example? And so he says that what actually ended up happening from the 70s onwards is that Jews on the left were forced, and he's very interested in leftist space, Jews were forced to suppress their own history and experiences within anti-racist circles. As a result, our society found itself defenseless as white nationalists intentionally used anti-Semitism to form its worldview, develop leadership, and fuel its growing social and political power. And he says, it's outrageous that the Jewish community on the left never gets to lift up its experience with anti-Semitism, which is actually a form of racism in the US. It is told who it is by others and has very little agency to define itself. The truth is that the Jewish community has never been white. It has only been allowed temporary access to the privileges of whiteness. And he says, and again, we're linking this back to some of what Baldwin said, that the provisional access to privilege parallels the rise of modern anti-Semitism in Europe, where Jews were used as the scapegoats of the ruling class in Europe, a buffer between the haves and the have-nots. So where does he end this? That Jews in this country hold a form of temporal privilege. With the Jewish community, any semblance of temporal privilege is contingent on the basis that Jews suppress their primary identity as Jews, except in ways found acceptable by larger society. And when Jews choose to self-actualize their own identities, the threat is always delivered that if the Jewish community doesn't behave itself, access, safety, and opportunity can be taken away. And he says, sorry, but this doesn't happen because Jews are seen as primarily white, but because they are seen as something other than white. That if you're white, it doesn't get taken away. White communities don't receive threats like this. They don't need to. So we can see here how some of this tension is really fitting into an overall structure of white supremacy. And so what I really am interested in and want to spend a little bit of time on for the rest of the time that I have sort of in the lecture portion of this, and I am really hopeful that there are lots of questions, because I don't want to talk at you forever without getting to what you want to hear. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these challenges, but ultimately when we think about how white supremacy functions, and one of the major ways that it functions is by creating distance between marginalized groups. And again, going back to what Charles Mills was writing, that is really a lot of his concern as well as Eric's. That actually what we see is that white supremacy is winning the more that this rift between marginalized communities is allowed to continue. And I think we all would allow that actually that rift might be being stoked by outside forces, but it is happening inside the communities themselves, as there is racism inside the Jewish community and anti-Semitism inside the Black community on the one hand, and sort of distancing and seeing each other as unalike also happening. So in the last year or in the last few years, I would say that this how the fight against white supremacy plays into this has become wildly clear. We have, of course, Charlottesville, the Capitol insurrection, and the 1776 Project, and the ongoing attack on critical race theory. And I would argue that these three things show in clear relief that the struggle of the Black community and the Jewish community, and in that Black Jewish people as well, is clearly intertwined. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the 1776 Project, but I just want to point to a couple pieces from Charlottesville and the Capitol insurrection. Of course, Charlottesville, people were chanting, "You will not replace us," but they were also chanting, "The Jews will not replace us." Now, that does not mean literally that they thought that Jews are going to replace white people. It is from a conspiracy theory known as the Great Replacement that argued that because Jews are all powerful, that actually one of the sort of ways that Jews are going to control things is by flooding the US with undesirable elements, and include in that. So that's where, you know, the sort of George Soros open borders myth comes from, for example, and also things like the idea that interracial marriage, homosexuality, all of these things are promoted by Jews. The Capitol insurrection, of course, was an attack on the institution of democracy, and had the Confederate flag, which obviously is a racist symbol at its heart, and also people wearing T-shirts that said things like Camp Auschwitz and so on and so on and so forth. White supremacists very clearly view Black people and Jewish people as enemies of the society that they want to live in, albeit in different ways, that there's just different roles played in that. The 1776 Project, which thankfully had a very short life, but is now, I would say, alive in many ways in the attack on critical theory. The 1776 report tells a story that I call an intellectualized version of the Great Replacement theory, which comes out in some of these attacks on critical race theory as well. So one of the ways that the story is told is that Jewish intellectuals inspired Black academics to create critical race theory and identity politics, the ultimate goal of which is to subvert the American way of life. And I'm going to sort of quote from the 1776 Project, which I read so that you don't have to. The modern revival of identity politics stems from mid-20th century European thinkers who sought the revolutionary overthrow of their political and social systems, but were disillusioned by the working class's lack of interest in inciting a revolution. This setback forced revolutionaries to reconsider their strategy. One of the most prominent, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, argued the focus should not be on an economic revolution as much as taking control of the institutes that shape culture. In Gramsci's language, revolutionaries should focus on countering the hegemonic narrative of the established culture with a counter narrative, creating a counterculture that subverts and seeks to destroy the established culture. It continues. Gramsci was an important influence on the thinkers of the Frankfurt School in Germany, who developed a set of revolutionary ideas called critical theory. Now, if you know much about critical theory and critical race theory, you know that these two things are actually not related, although critical race theorists do take some framing from critical theory. But it's very interesting here that, so Gramsci himself is not Jewish, but the Frankfurt School was majority Jewish. And they say Herbert Marcuse, one of the members of the Frankfurt School who immigrated to the US in the 40s, became the intellectual godfather of American identity politics. With little hope that the white American worker could be coaxed to revolution, Marcuse focused not on instigating class conflict, but on instigating cultural conflicts around racial identity. And they continue, this led to the development of critical race theory. And they say that critical race theory, we all know sort of what the thought there is that minority racial groups are oppressed by white majority races. They believe that sort of racial divisions should be stressed, and that the critics of critical race theory say that critical race theorists want to promote fundamental social transformation, and they sort of continue on and say identity politics activists often are radicals whose political program is fundamentally incompatible not only with the principles of the Declaration of Independence, but also the rule of law embodied by the US Constitution. When activists are discussing seemingly innocuous campaigns to promote diversity, they're often aiming for fundamental structural change. So why do I say that this is sort of an intellectualized version of the Great Replacement theory? What the 1776 Project did in a very interesting and subtle way is say that Jews brainwashed Black academics to talk about race in order to have a revolution, which is very nefarious in its sort of framing, and also is very, very subtle in how it's picking up on anti-Semitic tropes. And so what the sort of great replacement theory and this sort of coming together of anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism really says to me today more than ever, and with democracy under great threat, is that the ending of the fracture between Black and Jewish communities is so crucial right now, because we're being painted, all of us, with the same brush as trying to destroy America. So that is kind of a large frame sort of the history of the rift, and why I think it's important that we reframe it and start to work together. I would be remiss though if I stopped there. We talk so frequently about the idea of Black-Jewish relations, and that actually erases a significant and growing group. That sort of slash or hyphen, however we want to say, erase the people who straddle the line between the two communities. Ooh, sorry, I hit the wrong button there. Of course, there are two distinct communities that need to commit themselves to dialogue, intercommunity understanding, and alliance. But this assumes a monolithic Jewish identity as racially white, as we've talked about. And of course, there are Jews by color, including numerous Black and mixed race Jews like myself, by birth or by conversion. And that's a growing portion of the American Jewish community that, while growing, has also been part of the community for a long time. And when we talk about Black-Jewish relations in this way, which on the one hand is very important to understand, Black Jews are made invisible. So we need to consider, when we're thinking about this sort of breakdown, how do we talk about intercommunity overlap or intercommunity relations when we ignore overlap? We ignore the fact that Black Jews face anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism on the one hand and anti-Black racism on the other inside our communities and also from the outside world. And Black Jews are often expected to choose identities inside each community. The reality is that this erasure of the existence of Black Jews, when we talk about things like Black-Jewish relations and the breakdown, has been the main mode of talking about this for a long time. And it's really only recently that we've begun to recognize that that erasure exists. For example, we have basically no history of Black Jews from the Civil Rights era or any other period through the lens of Black-Jewish relations, other than pointing to the odd sort of Black-Jewish celebrity or figurehead. The reality is that I think that this is also emblematic of the reality that broader societal issues of race and racism play themselves out inside the Jewish community, and broader trends of anti-Semitism play themselves out inside the Black community. So as I said, I spend most of my time working on racial justice inside the Jewish community. And so I want to sort of leave you with a little bit of a sense of where the Jewish community is today. So the Jewish community, what we see inside the Jewish community at large is the beginnings of difficult conversations around the race and racism that happen inside our community at varying levels, as well as trying to sort of revitalize the civil rights era commitments to racial justice that never really died down inside the Jewish community, but have really ramped up in the last number of years, and especially since Trump's election. So there's a lot of looking inward. For example, the majority of large Jewish organizations right now have racial equity, diversity, and inclusion offices that actually look at their work inside the organizations, whether it's a DEI staff or employee resource groups. The existence of Jews of color as a growing leadership group is really pushing the envelope there. Advocacy, harkening back to some of the Black Jewish relations from the civil rights era, is really huge, and I will tell you personally a really meaningful moment. My Jewish community is inside the reform movement, and I attended the biennial, which is the largest gathering of American Jews. It happens theoretically every 2 years. Of course, the last one was 2019, and we don't know when the next one will be. And in Chicago, there was a resolution around supporting reparations that was adopted. It was a very tearful moment for me and many other descendants of slavery. Of course, my family's from the Bahamas, so we wouldn't get American reparations, but that's a whole other story. And the organization that I work for and my team and a parallel team that works on civil rights has been lobbying heavily for voting rights and is really invested in sort of democracy preserving initiatives, recognizing that this current failure of democracy that we're staring at is dangerous for all minority communities. And showing up has been really huge. So most synagogues these days have an anti-racism committee or reading group. And this is sort of a growing phenomenon. And after sort of the racial reckoning of after George Floyd's murder, this was even more so. I think that I spoke to something like 30 congregations in 3 months in the couple of months after that. And then, of course, anti-Semitism. There's high concern about highest levels of anti-Semitism on record, along with a feeling of being unheard in social justice and leftist spaces. And I would be remiss, of course, if I didn't talk about what happened on Saturday in Texas, where, yes, that was an Islamist extremist, but the conspiracy theories that he was spouting about Jewish power are taken straight out of white nationalist playbooks and adopted from, for example, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that was a forgery that Jews control the world, and so on and so forth. And one of the most sort of strange moments in that story, which I've been following very closely for obvious reasons, was that he demanded to speak to Rabbi Angela Buchdahl of Central Synagogue in New York. Most of us has kind of ascertained that, he thought he was calling the head Jew to get things done, right? That the rabbi of Central Synagogue in New York must be the head Jew, which is kind of funny. I have to laugh or I'll cry, but that we're seeing these conspiracy theories pop up in unexpected places with violent results. So a few examples, of course, when we think about inside the Jewish community is the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. The shooter's manifesto talked about Jews flooding America with immigrants. It was a rant against HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. In Muncie and in the synagogue in the kosher grocery store in Jersey City. Those were Black nationalists spouting very similar conspiracy theories. And then, of course, the Islamic extremist in Texas. And so because of this sort of conflict that I've talked a little bit about around Jews and whiteness, it has become very complicated and has left Jews feeling quite isolated. So one last piece of where the Jewish community is going. I love to sort of end here. This is and this kind of ties us together with civil rights era and Alliance. So this is a different march. You have Rabbi Eisendrath holding a Torah in the front row. Of course, you see Heschel in the corner. Martin Luther King is there, and they're marching. This was in Washington. And on the other side of the screen, you see the last Women's March that was led after the conflict with Tamika Mallory by a group of Jewish women of color who sort of engaged and leaned into the conversation around anti-Semitism with Tamika and other leadership inside the Women's March, and ultimately were invited to march. The woman you see right at the front holding the Torah is Shahana McKinney-Baldwin, who lives in Wisconsin and runs a phenomenal organization called Ed Dote, and various other friends and colleagues of mine are in that group. So the Alliance is there and changing. The Alliance is there. The need to sort of fight against anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism are recognized more and more and more as tied. So where to? What's my vision? Why do I talk about this? I'm coming back at the end to Charles Mills. And in his piece, he ends his piece, and it's a really interesting piece where he actually spends time talking about some of the differences in how Black people are perceived and Jews are perceived in America, and the ways in which, and some of that is around the ways in which oppressions are played out, but some of it is also differentiating things about how Jewish whiteness functions versus how the color line functions for the Black community. And he ends, and I think this kind of ties it together nicely. He ends by addressing the Black community first and then the Jewish community. And he says, to the Black community, to my own community, I would say this. The narrative of oppression we have inherited from hundreds of years of slavery and subjugation in the West is in danger of degeneration and needs to be redirected against the appropriate target. We betray those who gave their lives in the struggle against racism if we embrace racist and anti-Semitic ideas. What ideas is he pointing to? He is pointing very clearly to sort of conspiracy theories that are alive and well inside Black community spaces about Jewish control. And he says the assertion of Black personhood and the demand for Black respect, far from leading us to condone Black wrongdoing and Black anti-Semitism in the name of solidarity, require us to condemn them for the sake of our own self-respect. He then turns to the Jewish community and says this: while always keeping alive the memory of the Jewish Holocaust and recognizing the continuing danger of anti-Semitism, and of course, yes, this includes anti-Semitism from Black people, you need to update the traditional narrative of Jewish victimization. Updating your narrative means that recognizing that, in addition to your own heroic efforts, part of the reason for your success on this content is that doors have been opened to you that were closed to non-whites. And then he ends by talking to Jews as well as other white people. And he says, so your moral responsibility with those doors open is to throw your political and organizational weight behind the opening of these doors to everyone, so that whiteness, Blackness, and Jewishness will be equally connected to and thereby equally disconnected from personhood. All races and ethnicities will have an equal chance in a non-racial polity. He doesn't mean, just to be clear, he doesn't mean like a colorblind, he just means one where the sort of politics of race no longer exist. And the shameful dark ontology inherited from the shadowed and divided Enlightenment will disappear in a blaze of egalitarian light. So why do I do this work? Because I believe in, I'm going to stop my screen share. I believe really deeply in Charles Mills's mission and Charles Mills's vision, that we both Black community and Jewish community need to sort of recognize our own positionality around how the color line plays out, and how I warned you this dog was going to climb all over me, that we need to sort of recognize our own positionality and also recognize the shared risks to our communities that are posed right now by the sort of decay of democracy that we are seeing. So I have talked for, I think, an hour, so I'm going to stop talking and open the floor. I can go on and I'm happy to, but I want to make sure that there's considerable time for questions and answer. I'm going to take a sip of some iced tea to get my voice back, and I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Tema. The first question that we have in the chat is, would you say that anti-Semitism existed before the 1960s with derogatory writings from W.E.B. Du Bois and Pan-African advocates such as Marcus Garvey?
Absolutely, and a lot of that ties to some of the existence of the color line that existed all along. And so there are absolutely examples throughout American history of Black anti-Semitism and Jewish anti-Black racism. That is very real. It just accelerated in different ways when the communities were physically distanced from each other by sort of access to the middle class for the Jewish community in a different way than what the Black community had access to. I think it's also really important to remember that the Jewish community sort of qualitatively changed as well, and quantitatively changed, and that you're actually talking, when you look at late 19th century Jewry versus or mid 19th century Jewry moving into the 20th century, there's quite a transition between who the Jews of America were, moving away from a Sephardic community and a well-educated sort of English, German, French Jewish community that was very much a middle class and upper middle class community, to the influx of Jews from Eastern Europe. And that also changes, by the way, the racial line about Jews. And it's really fascinating. It's part of what I study is interfaith marriage. And it's actually really fascinating. If you go back to like early days of New York City, there's actually a letter written by a prominent British Jewish woman who lived in New York back to her family in England. And she's like bemoaning the fact that one of her children married, I believe it was a Delancey. It was someone sort of with one of those like founding New York names. And like saying that she needs to send her other child back to England to find a suitable spouse. And so you can see like a qualitative difference between, you know, this is sort of a class of essentially like Jewish gentry that fit in with the sort of upper crust New Yorkers at one point, which is very different than the tenements of New York in like the early 20th century, full of Eastern European immigrants who are working in sweatshops and so on. So it's like there's a lot of competing histories going on at the same time as these sort of changing racial politics are happening. I just am more of an expert on civil rights era and later. But I will say that those texts 100% exist. It's, you know, those exist. And also there were Jews who owned slaves, right? It goes both ways on this. And there's, I'm sure, racist writings from earlier. One thing I also want to mention is that there's a great, I believe it's in Al Vorspan's essay, but it might be somewhere else in that volume, where he quotes from a speech talking about anti-Semitism in the Black community. And he says, this could be in this book now in 1969, but this is actually from 1942. And that speech is also kind of being like, and this is something that could have happened 20 years ago. So this is not a new story. We're kind of stuck in a loop. And it's very weird sitting on both sides of the loop because it's just a really sort of contradictory position to be in.
I am also an Ashkenazi Jew. I wonder how Sephardic Jews in US born here with much darker coloring are regarded and placed in history and the present.
Sure. So history is actually a little bit easier. Sephardic Jews were the earliest Jews in the US and were on the white side of the color line legally. When you read the history of Jewish slave ownery in the South, which what I will say is that Jews owned slaves at about proportionately the same amount. This is not, I am not a numbers person, but if you look at sort of proportion of the population of the South, Jews own slaves at I believe it's either a slightly lower or equal proportion. But those Jews were majority Sephardic Jews. In New York, the early Sephardic Jewish community of New York was regarded as being on the white side of the color line. Now, if there's one thing that we know about race, is that it's complicated. And I am sure, and this is not something that I've studied extensively, but I'm sure that it's the case that the racialization of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews being from the Middle East, Sephardic Jews being from Spain, originally Spain and Portugal, but then with sort of forced displacements after the Inquisition, ended up in places like North Africa and Turkey, and then also because they were in Spain and Portugal, also ended up in the New World. So like Brazilian communities, a lot of the Caribbean Jewish communities, and some of the very early American Jewish communities were also Sephardic. Mizrahi Jews being Jews who never left the Middle East after Jewish diaspora. The changing ways that Arabs have been racialized has probably fallen out on Jews with sort of more Middle Eastern, in quotes, coloring as well. But legally, and also on the census, the Middle East and North Africa is considered a subgroup of white, and was on immigration documents, for example. So it's really interesting thinking about Jews were, for a long time, you had to say you were a Hebrew on immigration documents, but Hebrews were considered to be like a subclass of Caucasian. I really find one of the things that I actually find fascinating about looking at the question of Jews and race is that you kind of see how socially constructed race is when you look at examples of groups that don't neatly fit the racial binary. So whether that's Jews or, like I mentioned, those anti-miscegenation cases from the 30s, trying to establish whether somebody from, I believe it was India, I could be wrong. It's been a while since I read the paper, but literally a legal case trying to determine whether they were legally allowed to marry somebody white or not. It really shows how active this process of reifying a color line is and has been in America. Yeah, so it's really interesting. And also, there is within the Jewish community itself, of course, the existence of minorities within minority community, and Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews are a significant minority community inside the Jewish community here. And Mizrahi Jews, of course, have various breakdowns into groups with distinct traditions. Like, for example, Syrian Jews and Iranian Jews are very different from each other, and very different from Jews from Amazigh, which is sort of indigenous to Algeria Jews, and so on and so forth. So really interesting nuance within the community, which is why the conversation around Jewish whiteness actually also only goes so far. And one of the fascinating things about this example of the terrorist calling Angela Buchdahl, Rabbi Buchdahl, on Saturday is, for those of you who don't know Rabbi Buchdahl, she is a Korean, her mother is Korean, her father is Ashkenazi, and she looks very Asian, she looks very Korean. And so in that moment, I had like a weird sort of emotional moment about this, because on Saturday, the face of Jewish control to this conspiracy theorist was a Korean Jewish woman. And there was, I had sort of, like I said, you have to laugh or you're going to cry. I sort of sat there and I was like, well, I guess Jews of color have officially made it. On the one hand, we're seen as fully Jewish from the outside as well. So that on the one hand, and also this sort of feeling of when we're thinking about like why it's so important to come together against threats of extremism, a really clear example.
Well, if there's something that you think we need to know, would like to know, because it has been absolutely fascinating listening to you talk about the alliance, the fractures, and giving that historical perspective. So I'd love to hear if you have something else. Let's see if we have.
Yeah, I saw something come into the.
Yeah. How do we go forward and change the fractures?
Sure. So I think that the work that we need to do first has to happen inside our own communities, whichever community that we're in, and the people who bridge both, obviously working on both sides of this. There are glimmers of hope in the alliances, always, whether it's the persistence of historic relations, like, for example, close relationship between the ADL and the NAACP that's existed since the 60s. People like Eric Ward, who are working at the forefront of understanding leftist anti-Semitism and how that impacts the fight against white nationalism. So there are glimmers of hope all over the place, and those sort of alliances that persist. But I think so much of it is that our communities haven't taken deep internal looks at how these sort of broader structures of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism are playing themselves out inside of our communities. And there are all sorts of examples of this, and a lot of them feed back into those ideas of what I spoke about earlier, like Jews reacting very strongly when something anti-Semitic happens, or somebody Black says something anti-Semitic, a Black public figure says something anti-Semitic versus a white supremacist saying it. And some of that, I think, like, on the one hand, I think there's like a little bit of, we've all been socialized to believe that Black people are dangerous because that's how anti-Black racism works. So I think there's a little bit when Charles Mills talks about the psychology that the politics of race produce, that I think is exactly what he's talking about. So on that on the one hand, and then the other piece that I would say that is at play, and it's also part of the psychology, is that we expect it from white nationalists, right? I think we all expect somebody who's going to wave a Confederate flag to also be anti-Semitic, like that feels like a given, or somebody who like it's just not a shock. Whereas I think there is a little bit of we expected better from somebody else who's been oppressed, and both sort of those civil rights writers are already talking about that dynamic, right? Saying that that the Jewish community has this recent history of the Holocaust, and on the one hand, and that should make them understand more the plight of Black Americans, and that discourse is there and like really present in all sorts of unexpected places. So I think a lot of it is doing that work. Some of it, yes, somebody chatted to us, a feeling of betrayal. I think that feeling of betrayal is huge, and I would say where I see it mostly is on the Jewish community side. And some of that ties into there's two pieces to it. One is, on the one hand, Jews, as far as people who are racialized as white, Jews participated at much higher levels in civil rights movement. And I think feel betrayed because literally Jews put down their lives for the civil rights movement. The temple in Atlanta was firebombed, all sorts of sort of historic alliances led to real physical danger against Jews. And we have shared enemies in groups like the Klan and the Nazis, the neo-Nazis, and so on and so forth. So I think there's that feeling of betrayal. And there's also sort of the dark side of the feeling of betrayal, which is something that I hear, unfortunately, often, which is, after all, we showed up, how dare they treat us like this, which is the same emotion, but turned into something negative, and turned into, that one's really painful to hear because it sort of ignores the fact that racial politics have actually contributed to the rift. It places the blame squarely in sort of almost like in Black entitlement or something like that, which completely ignores the fact that also there were dynamics, and when you read some of the stuff I didn't talk about with the rift, because it's sort of beyond the scope of what I wanted to talk about today, is that there were growing feelings of feeling patronized as sort of Black nationalism and Black power sort of came to the fore. The idea that these sort of Jewish educated middle class and upper middle class Jews were funding the movement and showing up and like being half of the board of Black organizations did not sit well with people either. And so that's some of the ways that identity politics played in, and some of what Eric's talking about in the 70s, with Jews becoming white allies only.
Okay, another question is, do you think poverty and lack of financial education contributes to the rifts?
Yes. So I jokingly say that every time I get on one of these rants, I somehow end up sounding more and more like a socialist every time. But I think that one of the main factors here is who has access to capital and who doesn't, number one. And the related piece of that is who has access to education and who doesn't. I wrote an article in the middle of the sort of knockout attacks that were happening in Crown Heights, right before the pandemic, looking at this idea of what is Black anti-Semitism. And at that time, I actually found a study done by the Anti-Defamation League in, I believe, the 90s or early 2000s. And it's very funny how I found it. Mort Klein, who is the head of the Zionist Organization of America, who is just a virulent racist, he tweeted about Black anti-Semitism and said, like, look, you can even see here in this ADL study. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. I want to see the stats. And what the stats actually said was that when you control for education level, when you look at the numbers and control it for level of education, Black people and white people are equally, and maybe Black people like a touch less anti-Semitic than white people. So it's so deeply, so deeply tied to who has access to education and wealth. And by the way, Jews have been the scapegoat of sort of economic oppression since the Middle Ages. This isn't new. And so some of what Baldwin talks about especially, and also some of what Martin Luther King ends up talking about with when he turns towards the Poor People's Campaign, is the ways in which that economic oppression is really core. And so much of what ends up coming out of Baldwin, out of Vorspan, out of Heschel, is that the fight against anti-Black racism in the United States is the fight against an education system and a capitalist system that relies on subjugation and on economic subjugation. So they talk a lot about what does it mean to sort of be ghettoized? What does it mean to not have access to housing? What does it mean to not have access to high quality education? And especially in like Baldwin's piece and in Al Vorspan's piece, which again is about Black anti-Semitism, Jewish racism, that's really where they all end up. And I'm going to go back really quickly to sort of how Al ends his piece, because I think it says it exactly. Just give me 1 second to pull it back up on my screen. He says, and I sort of skipped over this part, but he says, until we deal with what we must do about it is not exhaust ourselves with symptoms, but deal with the root problems which spawn hatred and violence and frustration. Until we deal with the misery of the slums, until we eliminate unemployment and underemployment, until we deal with the terrible plight of powerlessness, until we humanize our monstrous welfare system, until we deal with the societal problems of American city, there will be anti-Semitism and there will be every other kind of prejudice and every other kind of antisocial theory. And some of the stuff that you see, for example, in the reform movement right now, which is my sort of denomination in Judaism, one of the reasons that reparations became such an important call is that recognition of the way that money plays a huge role in propagating the divide.
Thank you. Can you speak a bit more about the Canadian experience of anti-Semitism and anti-Black sentiment? You mentioned that your family moved due to the American experience of the two. Is Canada more progressive?
Canada is a funny country. So yes, Canada is, so Canada, I'm going to talk about it in a few different ways. Anti-Semitism in Canada has an atrocious history the same way it does in the United States, possibly even in some cases even worse, because of the role played by, for example, the Catholic Church had quite a bit of power in places like Quebec. My grandfather grew up in Montreal getting beat up by French Canadian kids every single day. My grandmother grew up being told no one needs to know you're Jewish, and sort of passed that along to my mother. There were restricted clubs. One of the worst race riots in North American history, or in Canadian history, one of the worst race riots was actually neo-Nazis against Jews in Toronto in the early 30s. So anti-Semitism here was extreme. It died down pretty quickly after the Second World War and changes to immigration policy. A really famous quote, like around immigration, Jews are trying to get out of sort of Nazi-occupied Europe, and an unnamed civil servant actually, when asked the question of how many to let in, he actually wrote "none is too many," and it like persisted in the historical record of Canada to the point that there's a book about that era called "None is Too Many." A lot of it paralleled what was going on in the US, but our Jewish community, of course, was also smaller. We ended up with one of the largest concentrations of Holocaust survivors after the war, and Toronto's Jewish community is one of the largest Jewish communities in the world. So we have a large Jewish community in Canada now, and a very well integrated community. Part of that is because we passed human rights legislation really early in Canada. The Human Rights Code came into force in the 60s. And actually the majority of complaints in that first decade were on behalf of Jews. And also we have a different history of the racial line. So there's sort of two pieces to that. One is that we don't have our Black communities that predate immigration, like contemporary immigration, are very, very small. We did not have, we were founded so much closer to when Britain outlawed slavery as a colony that we didn't have that many enslaved Black people here to begin with. It was also much less populated. So there's that piece of it. And there's very small pockets that have a history of being enslaved in Canada. What we do have is large Commonwealth immigrant populations. So systemic racism here looks quite different because it's tied to, for example, the fact that many of the sort of older Black, when I say older Black communities, I mean the 60s, like we're not talking like ancient history, came through immigration schemes. So came through domestic worker schemes and then through family reunification schemes. So the way structural racism that impacts the Black community looks is very, very different. And we never had that color line impacting the Black community because we just didn't have Black people here. And by the time Black people were coming, there was this sort of unifying Commonwealth identity on the one hand. And also the last piece of it is Canada. So the US, one of the ways that we talk about it, it's not quite so neat and tidy, is that the US, of course, has a melting pot view of immigration, that you come and you become American, whereas Canada has a multiculturalism policy. So we actually have a multiculturalism act at the federal level that's been enacted that encourages people to keep their ethnic identities. Canada is much more concerned with identity as far as ethnicity is concerned than race. So ethnicity comes first and then race. So for example, when I was growing up, we had one of the largest Caribbean festivals in downtown Toronto, and that was still a relatively new-ish Black community. My father was very high up in the city of Toronto government from when I was quite young. So it was a very different place to live. And growing up in downtown Toronto, there were like mixed race kids everywhere. And part of that is because it's a Caribbean community where that sort of mixed race identity is like much more common. And it does look very different. And I will say one of like the strangest experiences for me where I grew up where like, okay, like I know I passed for white, but there were a lot more kids who looked like me. And because it's a Caribbean community, Caribbeans usually will clock me as being mixed like very quickly. And when I'm in New York, there's a lot more sort of a variation of sort of color line and a lot more, you know, mixed race groups of people and mixed race couples and things like that now than there were when my mom lived there and was with my dad. And my first experience traveling to a city other than New York as an adult and just sort of seeing the color line really clearly for the first time ever was like a very uncomfortable experience because it was in DC and I was like, well, I am white here. Like there is no question in my mind. And it really sort of drove home the idea of passing and really like, it's one thing to know you pass for white. It's another thing to walk into a city where you see the impact of passing for white. And so really, really interesting in that sense. So Canada is very different. It does have persistent anti-Black racism for sure. But some of the ways that, but we also have like, there's all sorts of factors that contribute, like our police is less militarized. Where there is a really clear racial line, if we can call it a racial line, is with our Indigenous communities. And there's a big sort of awakening to that right now in a very major way. So that's a really interesting, and that's sort of like that historic, sort of where that historic line lies. And some of it is very similar to what happens in the US. It's just a little bit, it's become a little bit more in our face here because of, if you follow news in Canada, there have been some like really gruesome discoveries, for example, of like hundreds of buried children on the grounds of former residential schools and things. So it's been very sort of front of mind.
Thank you. The next question is, how can African Americans be helped to overcome their anti-Semitism and racism?
Whew, that's a big question. So I think there's a few factors, and like I said, and I'm going to be careful when I answer this because I spend most of my time inside the Jewish community, and my Black community is predominantly a Black Jewish community outside of my family. Just because I grew up here and Canadian stuff is very different, as we just talked about. So like my Black Canadian friends, it's a very different conversation. And most of the Black folk who I know in the US are either related to me or people I've met through work. So I'm gonna sort of only answer this one at a very surface level because frankly, it's something I'm still trying to figure out. And I really lean heavily on colleagues and allies who are working inside Black communal spaces. Some of it is through education, but I think a lot of it, and this feels like such a cop-out of an answer, but so much of the root of it is in these inequalities and the ways in which sort of the divisiveness finds sort of root in those inequalities. So I think really the answers are, and this is such an unsatisfying answer because it's like, yeah, we're all trying to do that, pushing for structural change that leads to improvement of economic circumstances and improvement of education. I think the other thing is, being careful of whose voices are getting boosted in communal spaces. So for example, you know, uh, for example, there is a lot of sort of grassroots activism that is that does sort of push back against or that does have sort of clear ideas of Jewish whiteness and what that means and so on and so forth, versus other organizations that might have been around longer and remember sort of how Jews fought to be seen as white in different ways and how that's impacted the story. I am not one to shut down grassroots activism. I just think that having those conversations is important. So I think it's a lot of it, a lot of what I talk about, a lot of what I spend time thinking about is what does it mean to form relationships, and what does it mean to form relationships with people that can have those conversations in spaces that I personally can't. I'm very cognizant of what it looks like for me as a white passing mixed race woman who is Jewish to tell people how to solve anti-Semitism in the Black community. I'm extremely cognizant of how absurd that looks to many people. And so I am very careful that, I might be able to have a conversation with somebody who knows me and knows my background and knows where I'm coming from and knows my education in this, and have them have conversations because they believe in healing those divides. And so I think that there's some role for finding those allies and having those allies have those conversations. By the way, that's what happened with the Women's March. It was people who were closely politically aligned with the leadership of the Women's March who went and talked to Tamika Mallory to explain why Jewish establishment organizations were losing their mind. And I say that I was also losing my mind. I will say, like, I wrote a piece about Tamika Mallory because, the sort of Nation of Islam stuff is very, very tricky.
Thank you. Another question is, can you talk about Jewish philanthropies, particularly agencies serving in communities of color?
I think I understand the question. So if you can clarify the question a little bit, I'm going to start in one place and try and go to where I think you are asking the question. So Jewish philanthropies, particularly agencies serving in communities of color. So I think there's a few pieces. So one is Jewish philanthropies generally. So the Jewish philanthropies that I am most familiar with are ones that serve inside Jewish community predominantly, and maybe have some social justice stuff on the side as well that is serving in communities of color. Not necessarily organizations who are like, I don't know that there are any sort of Jewish foundations, for example, that are sort of identified with Jewish identity, where their primary mission of that foundation is funding things in communities of color. But what there is inside sort of a lot of Jewish philanthropies and foundations is two things. Number one, they're inside the Jewish community. There is a growing trend of funding Jews of color-led projects, and many of those projects are racial justice projects. So for example, 3 years ago-ish, a major philanthropic initiative that was the coming together of a number of different funders. Thank you for clarifying, very helpful. So about 3 years ago, a number of funders came together to fund the Jews of Color initiative. It used to be called Jews of Color Field Building. It's now called Jews of Color. And they fund a number of projects inside Jewish communities, including a lot of racial justice projects. So it's been clarified, Jewish Board of Family Services, Education Alliance are two agencies. So I think there's a difference between philanthropies and agencies here. So the philanthropies are mostly pouring money in, whereas there are agencies that work in sort of social justice that receive money from philanthropies to do their work. Some of that, though, is some of what, for example, Al Vorspan and James Baldwin speak about, which is these sort of points of contact that are inherently have power relations, and some of those historic sort of rifts that have been allowed to continue, where some of this work is very important and is being done, but it's not, and hopefully in many cases it's being done in racially sensitive ways, but it might not always be being done in racially sensitive ways. And again, I live here, so I don't 100% know how that's happening, but I know here some of the conversation, not specifically about Jewish organizations, but about white-led organizations' role in child welfare, for example, in Indigenous communities has been a major topic. And I would imagine that some of that is the same looking at that. And so I think these are places where that sort of relationship to whiteness is interesting, and this relationship to access to capital becomes interesting, and relationship to power becomes interesting. And some of why I say starting inside and looking and trying to really learn, and taking Charles Mill's language, learn what our positions are vis-a-vis a political system of race, not a social system of race, a political system of race, and how our locations vis-a-vis that system actually impact the way that we perceive our roles in that system, and what that system looks like, I think is extremely important.
Okay, thank you. Another question: how do you understand the notion of white fragility versus white privilege? And then parenthetically, I have many books. Those are the titles of 2 recent published books. I expect they are both true, as many things are true at the same time.
Yeah, so I'm saying it on the record. I am not a fan of Robin DiAngelo, even if I think that there is truth to her concept of white fragility. And why I will say this is, one of the things that I don't think was in my bio is that I'm educated as an educator of adults. And what even cross-cultural sort of research on education shows is that adults do not respond well to being shamed in like any culture really that they've studied. And most of it is like very corporate. So they're looking at, North America, they're looking at South America, they're looking at like India, places where people like offshore their businesses, especially their call centers and things like that. So they are looking at particular cultures, not all cultures. But I am a firm believer that as an educator, your role is to educate people in a way that they can hear it. And we know that that adults don't respond well to being shamed. And so when we talk about something like white fragility, on the one hand, I think it's very, very real. I have encountered it many times. I'll give an example. I was teaching a class and we talked about Jews of color. And one of the questions came up, an experience that Jews of color commonly face is being asked like why they're in a space, or like how they're Jewish, like how are you Jewish? Because there's no sort of understanding that Jews of color could have been born Jewish. And so there's an assumption, there are all sorts of assumptions that either they converted or were adopted or whatever it might be. And number one, and also like a bit of an entitlement to ask intrusive questions, which plays very well into some of those when I talk about racial dynamics that happen inside the Jewish community. So we were having this conversation and somebody said, well, if I see somebody, Black in my synagogue, like, yeah, I'm going to ask them what they're doing there. And I said, why? And she said, well, I'm just curious. And I said, well, would you ask a white blonde woman who, of course, if you know anything about stereotypes of what Jews look like, I think I said a tall, thin, blonde white woman with blue eyes, just to make it very clear I was going very far outside of Jewish stereotypes. And she said, no. And the more I pushed back, she ended up actually saying, I feel very attacked. And you're hearing the way I talk, I'm pretty delicate. And it was sort of just like asking more questions like, well, why is it the case that you wouldn't speak to her, but you would speak to that person? And that was enough to make this person feel very attacked in that moment, which is defensiveness, right? And like, I think when I look at that moment, it meets the qualification of white fragility. The parallel one is white women's tears, which of course, again, exists. But I think one of the challenges is that we see these things and they exist. And triggering those things intentionally doesn't actually get us very far, I think. On the other hand, there is a moment where it's like, I can't coddle you anymore because I know I will say I ran out of patience, and I am an infinitely patient person, which is how I can do this work. But at a certain point, if you're not getting through to someone, you have to spell it out bluntly. And that is where I think those understanding those things comes in handy. And so for me as an educator, those ideas and concepts are things that are in my toolkit to understand dynamics that might play themselves out. And also in conversations around race where racialized people are in the space, as well as white people, to watch that dynamic. And at the same time, be really careful not to switch into shaming mode, which just puts people in defensive mode and they shut down, which actually might, there's actually interesting research on this from DEI spaces, where DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives in corporate context have failed specifically because people have actually made things worse in some organizations if those conversations aren't done well, and people feel shamed by their colleagues, which then leads to a rift in trust. And so the sort of ability to engage in conversation actually moves backwards. One last thing that I'll say on this, though, is that we are in this really weird moment. And I look at this sort of debate around critical race theory, and a bill was either proposed or passed in Florida that, like, you can't teach about race in a way that makes white people uncomfortable, is literally what the bill says, or it causes discomfort. And, and I look at something like that and I just think to myself, like, when we want to talk about it and think about the epitome of fragility, it's like, so the discomfort experienced by the people facing racism doesn't matter because hearing about it makes white people feel uncomfortable. The scary thing is that the way that this debate on critical race theory, which is not even talking about critical race theory at all, is playing itself out, is leading to more and more of that. And I think some of the divisiveness around conversations around race, because people are defensive, I don't have a clean answer to this, right? Like, and I think this is the challenge, is like, if you're somebody who's willing to look at race and look at racism, you're not somebody who's prone to the level of defensiveness that leads to the fragility. Where I think it's also, last thing I'll say on this, where I think it's also important, though, is that sometimes that does creep into people who are willing to look at race, but might not be, like, I talk about this in the Jewish community very often, is that the Jewish community has been phenomenal at showing up over the years for voting rights, for, anti-poverty initiatives, making relationships with the Black church down the street and doing interfaith dialogue and showing up at protests, criminal justice reform, all of these issues. But it's only in the last maybe 3 to 4 years that most Jewish community organizations have started to admit that there's racism inside the community that impacts Jews. And that is common, right? Like, that's not uncommon in white space. And so it's much easier to sort of look at racism happening over there than it is to look at racism happening internally. And thankfully, we're in a moment of racial reckoning. The only problem is I think we're in a moment of racial reckoning and backlash to racial reckoning happening at the same time, not sequentially.
Okay. The next question is, do you think there is an appreciation in Jewish spaces that enslaved Africans and their descendants in America do not have access to a common language, common country of origin, common religion, or common culture?
No. That's an easy answer. No, it's actually one of the things when I mentioned Charles Mills' list of like different ways that things have played themselves out and oppressions have played themselves out inside Jewish communities and Black communities. That's one that he points to. And I think that there's very little appreciation for it because I don't think it's talked about enough, frankly. When people talk about the Black experience in America, so much of the focus is on the contemporary experience. And, some of that conversation is happening in Jewish space now, largely thanks to one person who is a chef and a culinary historian, Michael Twitty, who's Black and Jewish. And he's a friend, and he and I did a really fun talk last year at Harvard, of all places. I was like, sure, I'll do this talk. This sounds great. Talking about a lot about what his work looks like. But he writes histories of the South, of food in the South. And so he looks a lot at like, what are the African origins of soul food, for example. And so he's really push that conversation into Jewish awareness. But it's still, he's one person. And not everyone has heard him, not everyone has heard of him. He has lots and lots of fans, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone knows what he's talking about. I see myself on the screen and all I can see is my dog's head. This is very funny. I think that this is something that America in general needs to learn about more, to the point that like I forget that about my own history, right? Like I connect to Caribbean history, I connect to Black American history. My dad was born on Staten Island, so as a Black man growing up on Staten Island and through the 50s and 60s, American Black, he had a real American Black experience as opposed to his siblings who immigrated, and had, it's really interesting now. He's the second youngest of 10. This is a little bit of an aside, but listening to some of the conversations about what it means to be born Black American and what it means to discover you're Black American, because the ones who came as teenagers had experienced a lot of life in a Black majority country before they came. So very interesting sort of way of sort of really seeing the color line and how it plays itself out in really perverse ways in the US. Anyhow, that was a bit of an aside, but I think, you know, so much of what it means to be from like Black American culture is also to forget that, you know, Black culture is an amalgam that of all sorts of African cultures. And I think, you know, that is something that feels very real to me, to the point that like, I think one of my family members did like one of those ancestry tests and found out where we were from, but like, I don't know. And so thinking about some of those pieces and just how far out of our memory, our sort of cultural memory that piece is. When I think of ways to have conversation, you know, I think that also a place of recognizing that Jews have a different history of diaspora, where because of the way that marginalization of Jews played itself out in the majority of the communities that Jews lived in, Jews were segregated across Europe, Jews were segregated in the Middle East, and in India and in China where communities lived, that it allowed for a fairly continuous stream of Jewish culture. And so, you know, there is a shared experience of diaspora, but it looks very, very different.
Okay, thank you. Next question is it still relevant in interfaith marriages that the mother is Jewish? Is one considered Jewish if father is Jewish and mother is Catholic?
Sure, that's a great question. So the answer is yes and no. It depends which denomination of Judaism and which country. So in the majority of, so first of all, I'm just going to do like a handful of statistics. Since 2010, 72% of marriages outside of the Orthodox community and the Jewish community are interfaith. 72%, it's like a clear majority. And it's been over 50% since like the 90s. It's a long history of sort of liberal Jews being in interfaith marriages. So there's that piece of it. So very important to know. In the 80s, the Reform movement, which is the Reform movement and the Reconstructionist movement, are at the sort of most liberal end of the Jewish communal landscape. And then conservative movement is considered in the broadly liberal orbit because it's not Orthodox. It's kind of like an arbitrary line between Orthodox and everything else is liberal. But conservative is kind of, I don't want to say halfway between. There's more of a commitment to Jewish law and keeping Jewish law inside the conservative movement. So the conservative movement rabbis will not officiate at an interfaith marriage. Reform and Reconstructionist movements are allowed to if they want to. And the Reform and Reconstructionist movement, beginning in the 70s in Reconstructionist and 80s in Reform, recognize that the children of an interfaith couple who are raised Jewish with the sort of markers of being raised Jewish, whether it's a mother or a father, are Jewish. The conservative movement does not recognize patrilineal descent, and the Orthodox movement most certainly does not recognize patrilineal descent. That has led to some interesting sort of Jewish communal politics. So for example, in Canada, Reform is the largest movement in the US, conservative is the largest movement here. Canadian Reformed Jewry, as a general rule, does not recognize patrilineal descent. So if you are an interfaith couple with a Jewish father and a mother from a different background, you are given the option, if you're choosing to raise your children Jewish, to have those babies. It's called an affirmation of Jewish identity, but like according to Jewish law, it's basically a conversion with a different name, so that should one day that child decide to marry somebody from the conservative movement, in the conservative movement, they are recognized as Jewish. That is not the same thing in the US, where the Reform movement is the sheer majority. So it's a really interesting dynamic. And the answer to it is like convoluted, and really depends just where in the Jewish communal landscape you land. The statistics about, so only about 25% of people who identify as part of the conservative movement are in interfaith families. And I am willing to bet you that the lack of officiation and the patrilineal descent issues are two of the primary reasons for that. Thank you for asking me questions about my previous professional life. I don't get to talk about this as much anymore.
Well, great. The last question, I think, is there is a lot of tension between support of Israel by some in the Jewish community and sharp criticism of Israeli treatment of Palestinians. Do you also see this playing into the divide between Jews and communities of color? If so, how do you address it?
Sure. So that is a huge tension. And it's really like, that could be a 2-hour-long presentation in and of itself. So I'm going to try and answer it really quickly and say a number of things. One is that some anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism and not all. And I think that there's tension that happens on sort of two fronts there. One is a reduction of anti-Zionists to meaning one thing, and that is anti-Semitic on one side. And the other is a reduction of Zionism to meaning one thing and equating that thing with racism, colonialism, and fascism on the other. And so that has become like a huge, we're getting really siloed in general. People are like, all of these sort of political affiliations are becoming really reductive. And so, you know, as an example, I saw somebody tweet yesterday something like, I don't care how progressive of a Zionist you are, you support this horrible thing that had happened. And it's like, okay, well, Zionism means a whole bunch of things, including people who believe in so Peter Beinart, who is a major Jewish thinker on sort of the far left of Zionists, believes in a binational state, for example, which I would say, like, to say that somebody who believes in a binational state is a colonizer and a racist, when he's saying, you know, actually one vote, one person on this whole land of the people who are living there with two cultural identities shared, because that's who lives there, that feels a little bit like to me. So part of it, I think, is we're in this really heated political moment. Another thing is that I think that there's a lot of mapping of American racial politics onto situations that don't quite align. And the Middle East is one of those situations for sure. It is just a mess in a very different way, where, like, yes, there is structural issues, but they don't map, like, the same way I just said about Canada. The structural issues in the US do not neatly map onto other contexts. And so I think there's a little bit of reduction going on there. I see this a lot. I've done trainings, for example, on anti-Semitism with like virulently anti-Zionist student unions that have then gone and turned around and done really anti-Semitic things 2 weeks later in the name of anti-Zionism. Like saying that, you know, they were going to subject all, just to give you an idea of some of the ways that anti-Zionism ends up playing itself out in anti-Semitic ways, that they passed a BDS resolution, and under the BDS resolution, one of the things that they said was like, okay, there was an exemption for kosher caterers for Jewish student events if you could not find a kosher caterer that adheres to BDS. Why is this anti-Semitic? Are they checking with like Aramark, who I don't know for sure, but like I wouldn't be shocked if they have holdings in Israel. Like, so who are they checking to see what their politics are? It was only the Jews who they were checking. And that was very similar with the Sunrise Movement thing that happened in DC 2 months ago, where they asked for the Jewish organizations to be dropped, the sort of Jewish progressive Zionist organizations to be dropped, even though there were a number of non-Jewish organizations who had actual financial investments in Israel and they weren't subjected to scrutiny. So those are some of the tensions that are existing on the progressive left right now, and they're getting worse. And so like, I don't have an answer on how to solve this. It's part of the reason that I do the work that I do, is because I love things that don't have answers, but I also love being in this like messy, hard work. Is I think learning more. So for example, there was a great thread, I don't remember who wrote it, on Twitter recently after what happened on Saturday. And it was talking specifically about Muslim communities. It was somebody Muslim. I believe it was the head of the Canadian Race Relations Federation. I could be wrong. But what he said was that he hears really often in sort of Muslim spaces that it's impossible to collaborate with Jews because of Zionism. And what he said was, look, you're missing part of the plot. For many Jews, they retain Zionist identity because of anti-Semitism, right? That anti-Semitism, and so one of the things that I try and have conversations with people about is like, look, if you have this cyclical history of being kicked out of countries that you've lived in, at a certain point, you want a country that you can go to and be safe in. And so when we think about, again, Charles Mill's idea of like, what's the psychology that is produced by the politics of race, that is a major piece of it. And, you know, when I think about a lot of Jews who, and this is something that I think a lot of people outside the Jewish community don't realize, but most of us were raised with sort of 3 pieces. Number one, which of our neighbors would hide us if the Nazis ever, or someone else tried to do a Holocaust against us? Who would hide us? Number 2, we need to have our passports in case we got to get out of here quickly. And where do we go if we get out of here quickly? We go to Israel. So a lot of us in the post-Holocaust generations were raised with that. And that's trauma, right? Like that's very clearly trauma. And trauma does not respond well to being told that the country that we see as our escape from the inevitability that bad things are going to happen again should be wiped off the map, number 1. And number 2, it doesn't respond well to being sort of siphoned off of the other people fighting against the risks to our community in the name of stuff that is going on with a government we have no control over. So it's very complicated and convoluted. And I mean, my biggest thing is that I think, and again, this comes down to the lack of understanding between communities, is that there needs to be more education and understanding. And by the way, some of what has contributed to some of the views of, some of the really reductive views of Zionism, and I don't mean like all anti-Zionist views, just some of them actually come straight out of Soviet propaganda that was used to oppress Jews in the 60s and 70s in the former Soviet Union. Which is then drawn out of historical tropes around Jews, that Jews are more loyal to other countries and that Jews see themselves as superior, that were, for example, in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So this is like not new stuff. What's upsetting, I think, to me as somebody who's Jewish is watching it get repackaged over and over and over again by the people who I want to be fighting beside. And that makes it very hard. So what I will say, like I said, I literally do this as 2-hour-long trainings on anti-Semitism and looking at tropes and looking at how anti-Zionism can feed off of those tropes. But I think the biggest thing for me is just like understand the psychology of where Jews are coming from when they get really defensive about Israel. And that's hard for me. Like I will say I am on the sort of left end of the spectrum there. But you know, I watch it happening around me and I do understand the psychology of it very clearly because of some of the pieces about that trauma.
This has been a very informative and thoughtful uh, those others who have stated that they're very grateful to you for giving this talk. So we want to thank you, and also want to say to the participants, thank you again, and thank you for your very thoughtful questions and the comprehensive answers that you gave, to make sure that they were fully understood. And for the participants as well, we did record, and there will be a recording of this placed on Ackerman's YouTube channel. We will notify you when it is ready, so no worries about that. It generally takes a week. Sometimes it can take a little more than a week, but we get them up, and you'll be able to go back to this because it's certainly worth going back and thinking through all of the things that you have given us here tonight. So thank you very much. We are very appreciative. With that, we'll say good night, and I'm sure your dogs are glad that we're leaving.
The older one is fast asleep, the one who you did. This guy is ready to run amok. So thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me. And wow, like, thank you all for your questions. I was so worried I was going to have to vamp for that hour. So thank you for your questions.
They really did it.
They were great questions. So thank
Yes. You take care.
you. Bye.
All right. Bye, everyone.